Hello aspirants, welcome to the Metis IAS GS2 Social Justice and Human Development Revision Marathon for Mains 2026. Over the next 3 hours, we are going to do something different. We are not going to read out a catalog of schemes. We are going to build the complete analytical architecture of social justice the way UPSC actually tests it. Look at the recent papers. 2024 asked about the poverty malnutrition cycle. Then 2025 asked about women's social capital. And 2025 asked about resource inequality and the paradox of poverty amidst plenty. Not one of these questions can be answered by simply listing schemes. Every one of them can be answered by the frameworks we build today. And this year, you have an extraordinary advantage. Between May 2025 and June 2026, India received a once in a decade cluster of flagship data releases. Those are NFHS 6, National Family Health Survey 6, and the first calendar year of PLFS, and the World Bank's revised poverty lines, and the global MPI's climate poverty report, and the entire women's reservation and a delimitation debate of April 2026. Whoever walks into the hall on 21st August will these anchors correctly placed writes feasibly fresher answers than the rest of the room. So 12 chapters across 13 scenes, we are going to discuss one integrated mental map. We are going to discuss. Let us begin. So we are going to discuss the first chapter, that is understanding social justice. Before going to discuss women, children, persons with disabilities, poverty, health, education, or welfare schemes, we must first answer one fundamental question: what exactly is social justice? This is important because the expression appears repeatedly in the Constitution, government policies, Supreme Court judgments, and UPSC questions. Despite many aspirants reduce social justice to just welfare schemes. But that is an incomplete understanding because social justice is much broader. It is the idea that every individual, irrespective of birth, irrespective of gender, irrespective of caste, religion, disability, age, location, or economic background, must have a fair opportunity to develop his her capabilities, live with dignity, and participate meaningfully in society. That is called as social justice. In other words, social justice is not about making everyone identical. It is about ensuring that everyone gets a fair opportunity to realize their potential. Social justice is what? It is about ensuring that everyone gets a fair opportunity to realize their potential. Because equality does not always mean identical treatment. Sometimes true equality requires different treatment. For example, a wheelchair user requires ramps and a visually impaired person requires assistive technology. A poor student may require scholarships A pregnant woman may require maternity support, and an elderly person may require geriatric health care. So, treating everyone exactly the same in these situations would not produce equality. Instead of that, it may actually deepen inequality. So, this brings us to one of the most important ideas in social justice. There is difference between formal equality and substantive equality. Formal equality means applying the same rule to everyone, but substantive equality recognizes that people begin from different social and economic circumstances. That is important rather than formal equality. Therefore, additional support may sometimes be necessary to achieve genuinely equal outcomes. So, this idea lies behind many constitutional provisions, including reservations, including reservations, affirmative action, scholarships, social protections, and targeted welfare programs. These are comes under substantive equality. Constitutional foundations. The Indian Constitution does not treat social justice as an isolated policy objective. It is one of the foundational principles of the constitutional order. The preamble promises justice, social, economic, and political. Fundamental rights protect equality, freedom, dignity, and protection against discriminations. And directive principles require the state to reduce inequalities, promote welfare, improve nutrition, strengthen public health, protect the children, support workers, and secure opportunities for all citizens together. Together, fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy es- establishes the constitutional architecture of social justice. One protects individual liberty, the other guides the state towards creating conditions in which liberty can actually be enjoyed. So, this is why UPSC often expects students to connect rights with public policy. That is why social justice matters. Now, let us ask another question. Why does every modern democratic state invest enormous resources in social sector programs? Why? Why do governments spend on education? Why do governments spend on health care? Why do governments spend on nutrition, skill development, social security, legal aid, housing, and livelihood programs? Why? Why do governments spend on all these issues, programs? Markets reward purchasing power. The constitution protects human dignity. These two objectives do not always coincide. Markets reward purchasing power. The constitution protects human dignity. These two objectives do not always coincide. A child born, let's say, a child born into poverty, a person with disability, a migrant worker, or an elderly citizen living alone may not receive adequate opportunities merely through market forces. You have to understand this very simply. Therefore, the democratic state intervenes to reduce structural disadvantages. So, expand opportunities for them and ensure that economic growth becomes inclusive. In other words, social justice seeks to ensure that development reaches those who need it most. The social justice seeks to ensure that development reaches those who need it most. Social justice is not charity, not charity. One common misconception is that welfare is an act of charity. No, not at all. The Constitution rejects this view. Modern welfare programs are not acts of generosity, they are instruments for securing constitutional rights and equal opportunity, not charity, not at all charity. They are instruments for securing constitutional rights and equal opportunity. Let's say a scholarship does not merely transfer money, it expands it expands what educational opportunity, expands educational opportunity. A nutrition program does not merely distribute food, it improves cognitive development, health, and future productivity. Legal aid does not merely provide a lawyer, it expands access to justice. It is operationalizes under Article 39A of the Constitution. Similarly, public health care is not merely a government service, it protects under Article 21, that is right to dignity and right to life. This distinction is extremely important for answer writing. So, whenever UPSC asks about welfare schemes, do not evaluate only expenditure, evaluate whether the intervention expands capabilities, expands opportunities, participation, and dignity. You have to evaluate whether the intervention expands what, from welfare to capability. What is the capability expansion here? This brings us to another important conceptual shift, that is, traditional welfare approaches often focused on distributing benefits, but modern social justice increasingly focuses on building capabilities. Capabilities, what capabilities refer to the real opportunities available to people to lead healthy. Capabilities refer to the real opportunities available to people to lead healthy, educated, productive, and dignified lives. Therefore, successful welfare should not merely increase in consumption, it should increase human capability. Let's say, for example, quality schooling develops knowledge, then primary health care improves productivity, nutrition enhances learning, skill development improves employability, women self help groups strengthen economic agency, accessibility enables persons with disabilities to participate independently. In every case, the objective is not to merely to provide assistance. The objective is to expand freedom and opportunity. The objective, you have to understand and you have to look at the examine the case, every case you have to examine the every case. In every case, the objective is not merely to provide assistance, the objective is to expand freedom and opportunity. Inclusive development Economic growth alone does not automatically produce social justice. A country may experience rapid GDP growth, but yet continue to face malnutrition, learning deficits, health inequalities, gender discrimination, or exclusion of vulnerable groups. 171 million people lifted out of extreme poverty. Therefore, development must also to be inclusive. So inclusive development means that the benefits of economic progress are shared widely across the society. Inclusive development means what? That inclusive development means inclusive development means what? That the benefits of economic progress are shared widely across society. It seeks to reduce inequalities in education, health, employment, income, assets, technology, and access to public services. For UPSC, inclusive development is one of the recurring themes connecting to social justice, governance, economy, and ethics. So that is why inclusive development is most important. And emerging challenges here is the idea of social justice is also changing. Earlier, the discussion largely focused on poverty, literacy, and food security. Today, new challenges are emerging, like digital technologies have created new opportunities, but also new forms of exclusion, that is, digital divide. Artificial intelligence raises questions about access, privacy, and algorithmic bias. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. Population aging creates new demands for healthcare, social security, and long term care. Urbanization increases challenges relating to migrants, informal workers, housing, and livelihood security. Mental health, care economy, digital education, and platform work have become important dimensions of contemporary social justice. Therefore, social justice in the 21st century is no longer limited to welfare distribution. It increasingly concerns building resilient, inclusive, and human-centered institutions capable of protecting citizens through rapid social and technological change. Social justice in the 21st century is no longer limited to welfare distribution. It increasingly concerns building resilient, inclusive, and human-centered institutions capable of protecting citizens through rapid social and technological changes. So comes to the data part. It will be useful for your answer writing in the May 2026. And the scale of what constitutional intervention can achieve is now empirically documented. That is, the World Bank's 2025 Poverty and Equity Brief records that India lifted 171 million people out of extreme poverty between 2011 to 2012 and 2020 to 23. The World Bank's 2025 Poverty and Equity Brief records that India lifted 171 million people out of extreme poverty between 2011-12 and 2022 and 23. So, with the extreme poverty rate falling from 16.2% to 2.3%, so this provides an empirical illustration of the broader constitutional objective under Article 38 to minimize socio-economic inequality. And the frontier is already shifting. The global MPI 2025 found 300 million poor people, 309, 309 million poor people worldwide living under three or four overlapping climate hazards. Hold both figures. We will return them into chapter number 8. What is the central message here? So, before studying any specific topic, remember one simple principle. Social justice is not about distributing distributing benefits, it is about expanding human capabilities. It is not about treating everyone identically. It is about ensuring that every individual has a fair opportunity to live with dignity. And it is not measured merely by the number of schemes announced. It is measured by whether people's lives actually improve. Keep this idea in mind, because every chapter that follows women, children, health, education, poverty, persons with disabilities, elderly citizen, and welfare delivery is ultimately an attempt to answer one constitutional question, that is, how can the state create a society where every individual has the opportunity to realize their full potential while preserving dignity, equality, and justice? How can the state create a society where every individual has the opportunity to realize their full potential while preserving dignity, equality, and justice? This is the ultimately an attempt to answer one constitutional question, that is this only. That is the essence of social justice. Now, what we have understood, this conceptual foundation, let us move to the architecture of the welfare state and understand how India attempts to translate these constitutional ideals into public policies. So, comes to the data anchors part. As far as chapter 1 World Bank is concerned, that is World Bank Poverty and Equity Brief 2025, 171 million people lifted out of extreme poverty from 2011 to 2022 23. Then extreme poverty rate 16.2% to 2.3%. Then global MPI 2025, 300 million poor people face 3 to 4 overlapping climate hazards. And constitutional spine here is preamble, articles 14, 15, 16, 21, 38, 39, 39A, 41, 46, and 47. Then comes to the PYQ corner. In the 2019 question, they asked, despite consistent experiences of high growth, India still goes with the lowest indicators of human development. In 2019, this question asked. Then 2025 question, resource inequality and the paradox of poverty. And then 2023, welfare for vulnerable sections, the consistent demand, explain why deprivation persists despite constitutional guarantees. Comes to the main ammunition part. Social justice under the Indian constitution is substantive, not formal. It obliges the state not merely to treat citizens identically, but to dismantle the structural barriers that prevent equal participation. This can deploy in any question on equality, affirmative action, vulnerable sections, or welfare philosophy. So then we are moving to the next chapter, that is the welfare state and India's welfare architecture. So till now that we understand what social justice means, let us answer another important question, that is, how does a constitutional democracy actually deliver social justice? Ideas alone cannot improve people's lives. Rights alone cannot eliminate poverty. Laws alone cannot guarantee equality. The state requires institutions, policies, resources, and implementation mechanisms. This is where the idea of welfare state becomes important. Before that, what is a welfare state? A welfare state is a state that accepts responsibility for promoting the well being of its citizens, particularly those who face social, economic, or structural disadvantages. Unlike a minimal state, which limits itself mainly to maintaining law and order, a welfare state actively intervenes to improve people's quality of life. So for that, it invests in education, it invests in public health, nutrition, social security, housing, livelihoods, skill development, legal aid, and social protection. So its objective is not merely economic growth, its objective is inclusive human development. So this is constitutional commitment is reflected in the directive principles of state policy, which encourage the state to reduce inequalities, protect vulnerable groups, promote public health, improve nutrition, ensure education, secure human working conditions, and provide social assistance. So, thus, the welfare state is not an optional political choice. It is a part of India's constitutional vision. Why does India need a welfare state? Why? Some may ask, if markets generate growth, why should governments intervene? The answer lies in the nature of inequality. Markets reward purchasing power. They do not automatically correct historical, social, or structural disadvantages. They do not automatically correct historical, social, or structural disadvantages. Markets reward only purchasing power. Let's say example, for example, a child born into a poor household, a person with disability, a tribal community in a remote area, or a migrant worker in an informal occupation may not have equal access to education, may not have equal access to healthcare, may not have equal access to credit, may not have equal access to technology, may not have equal access to justice. Without public intervention, these disadvantages often become permanent. Therefore, the welfare state attempts to level the playing field. It does not guarantee identical outcomes. It seeks to ensure fair opportunities. The evolution of welfare in India, India's welfare approach has changed significantly over time. In the early decades after independence, the focus was primarily on poverty alleviation and basic service delivery. The state expanded public institutions, schools, health centers, food distribution, and rural development programs. Gradually, attention shifted towards right-based development, rights-based development, education, food security, employment guarantees, information, and local participation became increasingly linked with legal entitlements. Today, India is entering a new phase. Today, India is entering a new phase. The focus is moving beyond welfare distribution towards capability creation. The objective is not simply to provide benefits, but to enable citizens to become productive, healthy, educated, financially included, and economically independent. This transition from beneficiary based welfare to citizen centered empowerment welfare, well, it is this transition from beneficiary based welfare to citizen centered empowerment is one of the most important developments in contemporary governance. India's welfare architecture. Let us now understand how welfare actually reaches citizens. Let me think of India's welfare architecture as a chain. Every link in the chain must function effectively. If one link fails, what happens? The entire system weakens. The first element is identification. The state must identify who requires assistance. Different programs target different vulnerable groups like women, children, senior citizens, persons with disabilities, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, migrant workers, small farmers, street vendors, or economically weaker households. Correct identification is therefore the foundation of effective welfare. Identification. However, targeting is not always perfect. Some deserving beneficiaries may be excluded, others who are not eligible may be included. These are known as exclusion errors and inclusion errors. Both reduce the effectiveness of welfare programs. So, this creates a continuing debate between targeted and universal welfare. So, targeting direct scarce resources towards those with the greatest need, but may produce exclusion because of documentation errors, outdated databases, or narrow eligibility criteria. So, targeting directs scarce resources towards those with the greatest need, but may produce exclusion because of documentation errors, outdated databases, or narrow eligibility criteria. And universal programs reduce exclusion and social stigma, but impose greater fiscal costs. So the opportunity and the appropriate design therefore depends upon the nature of the entitlement. So basic public goods such as primary health care, foundational education, and essential nutrition require broad access, while additional support may be targeted towards groups facing specific disadvantages. Then comes to the data point, a live illustration of this design choice. What is that? The Ayushman Vai Vandana card has made health cover universal for every citizen aged 70 and above, irrespective of income. An explicit policy shift from targeting to universalism for one demographic with 1.14 crore cards issued as of 28 February 2026. The second element is delivery. The second element is delivery. Benefits. Benefits must actually reach beneficiaries. This requires coordination among ministries, state governments, district administrations, local bodies, banks, schools, health centers, and frontline workers like teachers, Anganwadi workers, ASHAs, ANMs, panchayats, municipal bodies, and self-help groups all become crucial actors in welfare delivery. So most welfare programs ultimately succeed or fail at the last mile. A well-designed policy at the national level has little value of implementation, fails at the village, urban ward, school, or primary health center. Therefore, implementation is often more important than policy design itself. So, implementation is important. Delivery and last mile is also important rather than policy design itself. Then comes to the third element, that is participation. Modern welfare is no longer based on one-way distribution. Citizens are increasingly expected to participate in planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. Self-help groups, community organizations, village health sanitation, and nutrition committees, school management committees, social audits, and gram sabhas improve accountability because beneficiaries themselves become stakeholders. Citizens are no longer viewed merely as recipients of welfare. Citizens are no longer Citizens are no longer viewed merely as recipients of welfare. They are partners in governance, civil society, NGOs, and the development industry. Welfare governance is not delivered by the state alone. Welfare governance is not delivered by the state alone. Non government organizations, NGOs, community based organizations, charities, cooperatives, and voluntary associations contribute through awareness generation, social mobilization, last mile service delivery, legal support, research, innovation, policy advocacy. So their local presence often helps identify vulnerable groups and service gaps that formal institutions may overlook. However, legitimacy requires financial transparency, internal accountability, professional standards, and measurable outcomes. So organizations receiving foreign contributions are regulated through the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. This policy challenge is to maintain transparency and national security safeguards without weakening legitimate civil society participation. The appropriate model is neither state withdrawal nor unregulated voluntarism, but accountable partnership between government communities, and civil society. And note one distinction the examiner values. What is that distinction? NGOs generally mobilize expertise. NGOs generally, non-governmental organizations generally generally mobilize expertise, advocacy, service delivery, and external resources. Comes to the SHGs part. SHGs are member-owned grassroots. SHGs are member-owned grassroots collectives built on savings, credit, mutual trust, and collective agency. NGOs often facilitate development. NGOs often facilitate development from outside the community, while SHGs institutionalize agency from within the community. The strongest outcomes arise when the two complement accountable local government. The strongest outcomes arise when the two complement accountable local government. One further principle is decentralization. Social sector policies are often designed centrally, but their success depends upon local information. Panchayats, urban local bodies, schools, primary health institutions, and community organizations understand local needs more accurately than distant administrative structure. Therefore, effective welfare requires principle of subsidiarity. What is the principle of subsidiarity? Decisions should be taken at the lowest level capable of performing them effectively. However, decentralization without funds, functionaries, technical capacity, and accountability merely transfers responsibilities without transferring power. So, localization must therefore combine administrative authority, fiscal capacity, reliable data, and citizen oversight. And the next element is technology. Digital public infrastructure, direct to benefit transfer, digital payments, portable entitlements, electronic health records, digital education, and online grievance systems have transformed welfare delivery. Technology has reduced delays, improved transparency, and lowered transaction costs. However, technology is not a substitute for governance. Digital systems may create new forms of exclusion when people lack of internet access, digital literacy, documents, or accessible interfaces. So, therefore, technology should function as an enabler, not as a gatekeeper. So every digital welfare system must retain human assistance, offline alternatives, effective grievance redressal, and safeguards for privacy and data protection. And next element is convergence. In technology, that DPI, DBT, E-Sanjeevani enabler. It should be a technology should be enabler, never gatekeeper. The final element is convergence. Many social many social problems cannot be solved by a single department. Take child malnutrition. Providing food alone is insufficient. Children also require maternal health care, safe drinking water, sanitation, vaccination, early childhood education, nutrition counseling, and household income security. These are all needed. Similarly, women's empowerment requires education, skills, credit, safety, healthcare, childcare, asset ownership, and political participation. These are consist of all these things. This demonstrates an important principle that is complex social problems require integrated solutions. Effective governance depends on convergence across departments rather than isolated schemes. So effective governance depends on convergence across departments rather than isolated schemes. So this is all regarding the convergence. And the next element is accountability. How do we know whether welfare programs are actually working? How do we know? How do we know whether welfare programs are actually working or not? Earlier, success was often measured by money spent, schemes launched, or beneficiaries enrolled. But today, the things have been changed. Today, governance increasingly emphasizes outcomes. The real question are: have learning outcomes improved? Have maternal mortality declined? Has malnutrition reduced? Have persons with disabilities become more independent? Have women entered the workforce? Has poverty become less multidimensional? In other words, good governance measures changes in people's lives, not merely administrative activity. Earlier, success was often measured by money spent, schemes launched, or beneficiaries enrolled. But today, governance increasingly emphasizes outcomes. The real questions are: have learning outcomes improved? Has maternal mortality declined? Has malnutrition reduced? Have persons with disabilities become more independent? Have women entered the workforce? Has poverty become less multidimensional? In other words, good governance measures changes in people's lives, not merely administrative activity. Comes to the 2026 data point. One 2026 illustration worth carrying into the examination hall. What is that illustration? On 8th June 2026, West Bengal became the 36th state or union territory to implement Ayushman Bharat PMJAY, completing nationwide adoption and bringing the entire country into a single portable health assurance network. For a migrant worker from Malda working in Mumbai, portability across state lines is the difference between coverage on paper and coverage in practice. One example, three themes here, that is cooperative federalism, portability, and last mile inclusion. Comes to the challenges part. Major challenges. Despite significant progress, India's welfare architecture continues to face several structural challenges. What is the first challenge? The first challenge is awareness. Many eligible citizens remain unaware of their entitlements. The second is fragmentation. Multiple departments often work in isolation despite dealing with interconnected problems. And the third challenge is capacity. Local institutions frequently face shortages of trained personnel, financial resources, and technical expertise. And the fourth challenge is regional inequality. Implementation quality varies considerably across states and districts. Fifth challenge is digital exclusion. Technology improves efficiency, but vulnerable groups may face barriers due to lack of connectivity, devices, literacy, or authentication failures. Finally, many programs continue to measure success through expenditure rather than long term social outcomes. These implementation gaps explain why well designed welfare programs sometimes fail to achieve their intended objectives. The future of welfare. What is the future of welfare? The future of India's welfare state lies not in launching an ever increasing number of schemes. Instead of it lies in improving quality of governance. Future welfare must become more integrated, more evidence based, more citizen centric, more technology enabled, and more outcome oriented. It must become economic growth, human development, social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and institutional accountability. Most importantly, it must recognize the vulnerable groups are not passive beneficiaries. They are citizens with rights, capabilities, and aspirations. So remember one simple framework: a successful welfare state is not measured by the number of schemes it announces. It is measured by whether those schemes actually expand capabilities, opportunities, participation, and dignity. So you have to keep this framework in mind while you have writing an answer, because every topic that follows: women, children, health, education, poverty, persons with disabilities, elderly citizens, and vulnerable groups, other vulnerable groups, it is ultimately an application of this welfare architecture. Now that we understand how the welfare state functions, we can move to the first major pillar of social justice, to women led development and the transformation from welfare to empowerment. So comes to the data anchor part. Ayushman Vayu Vandana universal health cover for all citizens 70 plus regardless of income. 1.14 crore cards as of 28 Feb 2026. PMJAY overall as of 28 Feb 2026. 43.52 crore Ayushman cards, 36,229 empaneled hospitals, 19,483 public, 16,746 private. On 8th June 2026, West Bengal became the 36th state or union territory to implement PMJAY nationwide adoption with full portability. Rights based era institutions: RTI 2005, MG, NREGA 2005, FRA 2006, RTE 2009, Right to Education, NFSA 2013, National Food Security Act, FCRA 2010 as amended in 2020. Regulations: Regulation of Foreign Contributions to Voluntary Organizations, then DPDP Act 2023, Digital Data Protection Act, Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the Privacy Safeguards Framework for Digital Welfare. Comes to the PYQ Corner 2017 question. Hunger and poverty are the biggest challenges for good governance in India still today. This question asked in 2017. Then 2023 question. Welfare schemes for vulnerable sections. Performance and citizen awareness asked in 2013. Then public health care and the appropriate role of the state. The recurring demand: diagnose the implementation gap, not the scheme list. This question, public health care and the appropriate role of the state, asked in 2015, 2021, 2024, comes to the main submission, that is India's welfare challenge. India's India's welfare challenge has shifted from designing entitlements to delivering them. The binding constraint is the last mile, where identification errors, weak local capacity, and a digital exclusion decide whether a constitutional right becomes a lived reality. You have to deploy this line in any implementation: governance of welfare or targeting versus universalism. I'm repeating again. India's welfare challenge has shifted From designing entitlements to delivering them, the binding constraint is the last mile, where identification errors, weak local capacity, and digital exclusion, digital exclusion decide whether a constitutional right becomes a lived reality. This can be uses in your any implementation governance of welfare or targeting versus universalism question. Civil society, NGOs, and the development industry. Why civil society contribute? What civil society contributes? We discussed here so far. Till now, we discussed technology, awareness, fragmentation, capacity, inequality, digital exclusion. Outlay is not important, not is unequal equal to outcome. Then we are moving to the chapter number 3, that is women-led development from welfare to empowerment. Now that we understand India's welfare architecture, let us move to one of the most important dimensions of social justice, that is women-led development. Before discussing self-help groups, political representation, financial inclusion, or workplace safety, let us begin with one basic question. Why is women's empowerment central to national development? Many people think ever empowering women benefits only women, but that is not correct. The constitution takes a very different view. When women become educated, healthy, financially independent, and socially empowered, the benefits expand far beyond the individual. Families become healthier, children receive better nutrition, school enrollment improves, household incomes increase, communities become more resilient, economic productivity rises, democratic participation becomes more inclusive. Therefore, women's empowerment is not merely a social objective, it is an economic, developmental, and constitutional imperative. That is why the language of public policy has also evolved. Earlier, the focus was on welfare, women's welfare only. Today, the emphasis is increasingly on women-led development, cascading effect. It reflects movement from seeing women as beneficiaries of government programs to recognizing them as equal participants, decision makers, entrepreneurs, leaders, and agents of social transformation. Comes to the constitutional foundation. Article 14 guarantees equality before law. Article 15 prohibits discrimination on grounds of sex while permitting special provisions for women and children. Article 16 ensures equality of opportunity in public employment. The directive principles encourage equal pay, human working conditions, maternity relief, nutrition, health, and social welfare. Fundamental duties also encourage citizens to renounce practice derogatory to the dignity of women. Together, these provisions establish that gender justice is not merely a welfare objective, it is a constitutional value. Understanding gender inequality, despite constitutional guarantees, gender inequality persists. But notice something very important here, gender inequality is rarely caused by a single factor. Instead of that, it is produced by multiple disadvantages operating simultaneously. For example, a rural woman from a poor household may face economic inequality, limited educational opportunities, restricted mobility, unpaid care worker, poor healthcare access, digital exclusion, limited asset ownership, and weak political voice. These are all the things, disadvantages, multiple disadvantages operating simultaneously. Therefore, women's empowerment cannot be reduced to one scheme or one law. It requires transformation across multiple dimensions of life. This is why contemporary social justice increasingly adopts an intersectional approach. Different women experience different forms of vulnerability depending upon caste, religion, tribe, class, disability, location, age, and occupation. Effective public policy must recognize these differences. Comes to the education, the foundation of empowerment. Every meaningful discussion on women's empowerment begins with education. Education expands capabilities, it delays early marriage, improves maternal health, enhances labor force participation, strengthens decision making within households, increases political participation, improves child nutrition, and creates intergenerational social mobility. Therefore, girls' education should never be viewed merely as an educational objective. It is one of the most powerful instrument of social justice. However, formal enrollment alone is insufficient. Girls must also remain in school, complete secondary education, transition to higher education, and acquire relevant skills for productive employment. The quality of education, safe school environment, hostel facilities, digital access, and career opportunities are equally important. Economic empowerment, economic independence fundamentally changes social relations. A woman who has access to education, skills, credit, assets, markets, and employment has greater bargaining power within the both household and society. One of the India's most significant institutional innovations has been the expansion of self-help groups. Initially, they were viewed primarily as microcredit institutions. Today, their role is much broader. They build social capital. Social capital refers to relationships of trust, cooperation, collective action, and mutual support. Through SHGs, women learn financial management, develop leadership, share information, collectively negotiation with institutions, access government programs, and participate in local governance. These are all the things happened. Not only microcredit, you have to notice the shift that here important one. Credit alone does not empower women. Collective agency does. This is precisely why UPSC asked about women's social capital in the 2025 mains examination. That is why the message is clear. Empowerment becomes sustainable when economic opportunity is supported by collective organization. That is why SHGs is needed. India's contemporary policy disclosure increasingly describe the transition from development for women to women-led development, recognizing women as economic and social decision makers rather than the passive recipients. Development for women to women-led development shift has been highly visible. The implementation debate surrounding women's legislative reservation has renewed attention to the gap between women's participation as voters and their presence as lawmakers. The 2026 parliamentary developments connected reservation with the post-census delimitation process. The scale of this movement is now historic. Roughly 10 crore rural women are organized under DAY NRLM, the largest such network in the world. Over 1 crore SHG women have become Lakpati Didis annual household income above 1 lakh rupees against a national target of 3 crore. An initiative like Namo Drone Didi are placing frontier technology directly in SHG hands. Beyond that income, asset ownership income is important, but ownership of productive assets often matters even more. Women who own land, housing, livestock, financial assets, or enterprises generally enjoy greater economic security, higher bargaining power, and stronger decision making authority. Therefore, modern gender policy increasingly emphasize property rights, financial inclusion, entrepreneurship, market access, and digital finances rather than income transfers alone. NFHS 6 released on 29th May 2026 gives you stronger contemporary evidence of this transition. Women with a bank account they themselves use rose from 78.6% to 89%. Women who have ever used internet nearly doubled from 33.3 to 64.3%. Women owning a mobile phone rose to 63.6%. Financial and digital inclusion are converging into a new infrastructure of female agency. Comes to the political empowerment point we have discussed till now, education and economic development. Currently, we are going to discuss political empowerment. Political representation is another pillar of empowerment. Women's participation in panchayats and urban local bodies has significantly expanded over the past 3 decades. Past 3 decades. This has improved representation, local accountability, and attention to issues such as water, sanitation, education, nutrition, and health care. However, representation alone does not automatically produce empowerment. Sometimes women representatives face proxy leadership, limited financial autonomy, lack of administrative support, social resistance, or restricted decision making authority. Therefore, true political empowerment requires capacity building, leadership training, financial independence, institutional support, and meaningful participation in decision making. So, representation must evolve into substantive representation rather than proxy. The national level debate precisely we are going to, that is 106th constitutional amendment, the Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam of September 2023 reserved one third of seats in the Lok Sabha and state assemblies for women, with implementation tied to the first census after commencement and a subsequent delimitation. But in April 2026, Parliament considered an attempt to operationalize the reservation through an alternative delimitation route based on the 2011 census. A package introduced on April 16th comprising the Constitution, 131st Amendment Bill, the Delimitation Bill 2026, and a UT Laws Bill, which also proposed expanding the Lok Sabha so the quota could operate by 2029. On 17th April 2026, the 31st Amendment Bill was defeated in the Lok Sabha, 298 votes in favor and 230 against, short of the required two-thirds of majority amid concerns from southern states that population-based delimitation would penalize their demographic success. The accompanying bills were withdrawn. The result, the reservation stands enacted but remains inoperative, awaiting census and delimitation. One live case connecting gender justice, federalism, representation, and constitutional procedure, that is workplace registration, participation, and safe employment. Another major challenge concerns women labor force participation. Although educational attainment has improved, many women remain outside the formal workforce. Several factors contribute to this, that is unpaid domestic work, child care responsibilities, unsafe workplaces, limited transport, social norms, occupational segregation, wage inequality, and career interruptions. This explains why workplace safety, equal opportunity, flexible deployment, skill development, and child care infrastructure are increasingly viewed as social justice issues. The objective is not merely to increase the objective is not merely to increase employment statistics. It is to create conditions where women can participate with dignity, security, and equal opportunities. Legal protection against workplace harassment becomes meaningful only when complaints mechanisms are trusted, independent, accessible to informal workers, and capable of protecting complaints from retaliation. So comes to the data part. Here is your single most important data block this year, that is PLFS annual 2025 year. This is going to be your most important data block. The first annual calendar year cycle in 2025 puts a female labor force participation for ages 15 plus at 40%, with rural female participation at 45.9%. About 20 crore women are now in the workforce. This is dramatic recovery from 23% of 2017-18. But read it honestly, much of the rise is rural self-employed and unpaid family work. Participation without commensurate income security. Urban female participation still trails far behind. This is honest reading. And one of the workplace milestone is the new labor codes in force from 21 November 2025 codify women's rights to work in all establishments and all shifts. Codified, subject to consent and prescribed safety arrangements. The care economy comes to the care economy. One of the most important contemporary ideas is the care economy. This is going to be very important for your mains 2026 examination, whether it comes to GS2 or whether it comes to GS3. One of the most important contemporary ideas is the care economy. Every society depends upon care. Children require care, the elderly require care, persons with disabilities require care, patients require care. And much of this work remains unpaid, invisible, and disproportionately performed by women. So as a result, many women experiences time poverty. Time spent on unpaid care reduces time poverty. What is the time poverty? Time spent on unpaid care reduces opportunities for education, employment, and entrepreneurship, politics, and leisure. These are going to be our time poverty for women exclusively. Therefore, child care, elder care, community care services, and supportive workplace policies are not merely welfare measures. They are investment in gender equality, economic productivity, and human development also. This represents one of the most significant conceptual shifts in the contemporary social justice. Comes to the data part, and the PLFS gives you the empirical bridge between employment and care. 44.4% of women outside the labor force cite childcare and homemaking as the principal reason. That single number connects the FLFP debate to the care economy. Who's it? Health and reproductive rights, women's empowerment also depends upon good health, access to reproductive health care, maternal nutrition, etc. Access to reproductive health care, maternal nutrition, safe childbirth, mental health care, family planning, and adolescent health directly influences educational attainment, economic participation, and long-term well-being. Modern public health increasingly recognizes that reproductive health is not solely a woman's responsibility. That is greater participation by men, shared parenting, community awareness, and comprehensive reproductive education contribute to healthier families and more equitable gender relations. What is the persistent challenges? What are the persistent challenges? What are the persistent challenges? Time poverty we discussed, care investment we discussed, child care, elder care, community care, economic infrastructure, not welfare, and we discussing health, reproductive rights, complete the picture. That is safe childbirth, adolescent education, reproductive health is not solely human responsibility. Male participation, shared parenting, community awareness, and comprehensive reproductive education contribute to healthier families and more equitable gender relations. Comes to challenges part. Despite significant progress, important challenges remain. What are those important challenges? These include gender-based violence, child marriage, human trafficking, digital gender divide, low asset ownership, unequal wages, occupational segregation, poor representation in leadership, limited STEM participation, workplace discrimination, and intersectional inequalities affecting women belonging to disadvantaged communities. These problems remind us that empowerment cannot be measured only by legal reforms. Social attitudes, institutional capacity, economic opportunity, and community participation are very equally important. Comes to the way forward, the future of women led development lies in moving beyond isolated welfare schemes. Policy should focus on quality education, skills, economic opportunities, safe mobility, digital inclusion, asset ownership, care infrastructure, political leadership, gender responsive budgeting, financial independence, and institutional accountability. Above all, women should be recognized not merely as beneficiaries, but as equal partner in India's development journey. So you have to remember one simple progression, that is welfare provides a support, education builds a capability, economic participation creates agency, collective organization generates leadership, leadership transforms society. That is the journey from women's welfare to women-led development. Keep this framework in mind while you are writing an answer as far as women-led development is concerned in GS2 answer writing, because it can answer almost every UPSC question on women, whether the question is about self-help groups, whether is the question about social capital, whether the question is about workplace equality, whether the question is about care economy, whether the question is about empowerment. So now that we have understood women's empowerment, let us move to the next major pillar of social justice, that is children, adolescents, human capital formation, where we will see why the first two decades of life determine the future of individual as well as nation. Comes to the PYQ corner, as far as women development is concerned. In 2025, one question asked regarding women's social capital. Then 2021, one question asked, that is patriarchal social attitudes persistent despite schemes. Then 2021 asked SHGs poverty and malnutrition. Again 2019 asked women in local self-government as agents of grassroots change. And in 2015 they asked UPSC asked women's organizations and male membership. And one thing we have going to use in main examination, that is India's gender story in 2026 is a paradox of rising participation without proportionate power, 40% female LFPR, and 89% financial inclusion coexisting with unpaid care time poverty and a legislated but inoperative parliamentary quota. So the frontier of policy is converting presence into agency. This should be deployed in FLFP, care economy, SHG, social capital, and political representations questions alike. This is the thesis line. India's gender story in 2026 is a paradox of rising participation without proportionate power. 40% female LFPR and 89% financial inclusion coexisting with unpaid care time poverty and a legislated but inoperative parliamentary quota. So the frontier of policy is converting presence into agency. This could be deployed in FLFP, care economy, SHG, social capital, and political representation questions alike. So far, we have understood the idea of social justice, the welfare state, and women's empowerment. Now, let us move to another extremely important pillar of social justice, that is, children and adolescents. Before discussing nutrition, education, child labor, mental health, or child protection, let us begin with one simple question, that is, why do governments invest so heavily in children? Children are not merely beneficiaries of welfare, they represent the future human capital of nation. So every investment made during childhood influences health, learning, skills, productivity, innovation, and the economic growth of decades. Conversely, every deprivation experienced during childhood, whether malnutrition, poor health care, school dropout, violence, or neglect, reduce the capabilities of the individual and the productive potential of the nation. That is why child development is not merely a welfare issue. It is a nation building issue. The life cycle approach, that is, to understand child development, we must move beyond isolated schemes, that is, cycle approach. Instead of that, we should adopt a life cycle approach. I am telling you again and again. Human development begins long before a child enters school. It begins even before birth. Therefore, public policy must support children at every stage of life. The journey begins with maternal health and nutrition, followed by safe childbirth the first 1000 days, every childhood care, school education, adolescence, and finally the transition into productive adulthood. If this chain is strengthened, human capabilities expand. If any link weakens, the effects often continue throughout life. This is one of the most important ideas in contemporary human development, that is, maternal health and the first 1000 days. The most critical period in human development is often described as the first 1000 days. From conception until approximately 2 years of age. During this period, adequate maternal nutrition, institutional health care, breastfeeding, timely immunization, micronutrients, and responsive caregiving determine physical growth, brain development, immunity, learning ability, and future productivity. It could be damage suffered during this period is often difficult to reverse later. Damage here is largely irreversible. Therefore, nutrition should never be viewed merely as a food distribution. It is an investment in lifelong human capability. This explains why maternal health, child nutrition, vaccination, and early childhood interventions remain central pillars of social justice. Early childhood care, the next stage is early childhood care. The next stage is early childhood. Children require much more than food. They need safe environments, early learning, play, social integration, language development, emotional security, and cognitive stimulation. Early childhood education significantly improves school readiness, learning outcomes, social behavior, and a long-term educational attainment. Therefore, child care institutions, community health workers, and early childhood education should be viewed as investments in future productivity rather than merely welfare expenditure. Nutrition and human capital comes to the nutrition and human capital. Now, let us understand the relationship between nutrition and development. What is nutrition and development? Many people assume nutrition simply means providing sufficient calories. Modern public policy recognizes that nutrition is far more comprehensive. That is, children require balanced diets, proteins, micronutrients, clean drinking water, sanitation, disease prevention, and maternal care. Malnutrition is therefore not only a food problem, it is also a health, sanitation, education, income, and gender issue. A malnourished child is more likely to experience poor learning outcomes, reduced immunity, lower productivity, and diminished earning potential in the adulthood. Thus, nutrition influences the entire cycle of human development. This is why contemporary policy increasingly speaks about nutrition security rather than the merely food security. Comes to the data part, NFHS 6 gives you one of the strongest contemporary evidences based here. Child stunting. Child stunting, chronic undernutrition fell from 35.5 to 29.3%. Severe wasting fell from 77.7% to 5.2%. Full immunization among children aged 12 to 23 months rose 87.1%. With the rotavirus vaccine leaping from 36.4 to 85.4%. A case study in what mission mode convergence can achieve, that is, but present the honest caveats, wasting overall has plateaued. Underweight prevalence remains high at roughly 31.8%. And the Global Hunger Index 2025 recorded India's child wasting at 18.7 percentage, second highest in that report. Structural undernutrition is retreating, acute undernutrition is stubborn. That asymmetry is an answer in itself. Stunting response to long horizon interventions, sanitation, maternal care, diet diversity, wasting demands acute phase management and income security, school education. As children grow, education becomes the next major pillar of capability development. Education is not simply about literacy. It develops critical thinking, communication, creativity, problem solving, social skills, constitutional values, and productive capabilities. These are all these things comes with education, that is especially from school education. However, more enrollment is not sufficient. Children must remain in school, learn effectively, transition to higher classes, and acquire skills requiring for future employment. Therefore, modern education policy increasingly focuses upon learning outcomes, teacher quality, foundational literacy, digital inclusion, safe school environments, and equitable educational opportunities. So that is why school education is most important in every child life, in life, adulthood, life cycle. The ASER 2024 released January 2025 recorded the strongest foundational outcome Since the survey began in 2005, the share of class 3 government school children who can read class 2 text rose from 16.3% in 2022 to 23.4% in 2024. Exceeding pre-pandemic levels with government schools improving faster than private schools, attributed fairly to Nipun Bharat's foundation literacy and numeracy mission teacher support structured assessment, then balance it. Even now, roughly 3 in 4 class 3 children cannot read at grade level and arithmetic remains weaker still. Recovery is real. The deficit is still large. Pre-primary enrollment of 3 years olds also rose from 68.1% in 2018 to 77.4% in 2024, aligning with NUP 20 National Education Policy, that is NUP 2020's integration of early childhood education. Adolescence comes to adolescence part. What is adolescence? Adolescence is one of the most transformative stages of life. Young people undergo physical, psychological, social, and emotional changes. This period shapes identity, self confidence, career aspirations, mental health, and citizenship. And however, adolescents today face new challenges. What are the new challenges? These challenges is most important to examination, academic pressure, competitive examinations, bullying, cyberbullying, social media dependency, substance abuse, body image anxiety, and loneliness increasingly affect mental well-being. Therefore, adolescent health can no longer be limited to physical health alone. Schools, families, communities, and healthcare systems must also support emotional well-being. So, teacher sensitization, school counselors, peer support system, mental health awareness, and early intervention become equally important. This is one of the fastest emerging themes in social justice, that is adolescence challenges. Comes to the data part, ASER 2024% ASER 2024 digital module quantifies this new terrain. That is 89% of rural 14 to 16-year old have smartphone access. 89% of rural 14 to 16-year olds have smartphone access, but only 57% use it for education, against 76% for social media, and girls lag and digital safety skills. Adolescent policy must therefore pair digital opportunity with digital protection. Then next, moving to child labor. Despite constitutional guarantees, many children continue to engage labor. Why? 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 Because child labor is not merely a legal problem. It is outcome of poverty, school dropout, household indebtedness, informal employment, migration, social exclusion, and weak enforcement. Simply rescuing children from labor is not enough unless families obtain sustainable livelihoods, quality education, social protection, and rehabilitation. Children often return to work. Therefore, effective policy must combine education, poverty reduction, social security, community awareness, and law enforcement. Child labor is ultimately a symptom of broader developmental failures and comes to the child marriage. A similar pattern exists in child marriage. Many assume child marriage persists because of weak law enforcement. That is not the correct thing. Law certainly matters, but the deeper causes include poverty, gender discrimination, school dropout, lack of economic opportunities, social norms, and insecurity. Therefore, preventing child marriage requires girls' education, financial security, community mobilization, healthcare, adolescent empowerment, and legal awareness. Again and again, the lesson is clear. Complex social problems require integrated solutions rather than isolated legal interventions. Child protection in the digital age, that is going to be very most important theme. Modern childhood is increasingly shaped by digital technologies. Digital platforms provide opportunities for learning, communication, and creativity. At the same time, they also expose children to cyberbullying, online exploitation, misinformation, privacy violations, screen addiction, and mental health challenges. These are all the challenges. Therefore, the objective should not be complete prohibition. Instead of that, public policy should promote digital literacy. Digital literacy should be parental awareness, safe online environments, age appropriation regulation, privacy protection, responsible technology design, and institutional accountability. And technology should expand opportunities while protecting children's rights. So that is why child development determines national development. Let us connect everything we have learned so far. Healthy children become healthy adult. Educated children become skilled worker. Emotionally secure adolescents become productive citizen. Well-nourished children learn better. Children protected from exploitation contribute more effectively society. Therefore, investments made during childhood generate returns throughout an individual's lifetime. This is why economists often describe early childhood investment as one of the highest return public investment. Social justice and economic development therefore reinforce one and another. So comes to the persistent challenges have been already visible. Despite significant progress, important challenges remain. These included liking. These includes like persistent malnutrition, learning gaps, unequal education quality, school dropout, child labor, child marriage, digital exclusion, mental health concerns, violence against children, unequal access among disadvantaged communities, and regional disparities in service delivery. These challenges remind us that child welfare cannot depend upon a one ministry or one program. It requires coordinated action across health, education, nutrition, women and child development, social justice, local governments, and communities. So this is the most important thing, not only single institution or one ministry or one program, as far as children welfare cannot depend. Comes to the way forward, the future child policy should focus on early childhood investment, quality schooling, nutrition security, preventive health care, mental health support, digital safety, community participation, teacher capacity, family awareness, and integrated service delivery. The emphasis should shift from fragmented welfare schemes towards a continuous human development strategy extending from birth to adulthood. So remember this progression. Healthy mothers create healthy children. Healthy children learn better. Educated children acquire skills. Skilled youth become productive adults. Productive adults strengthen the economy and democracy. That is why child development is not merely a welfare objective. This is chain linkage, life cycle approach. It is the foundation of human capital formation and inclusive national development. Keep this framework in mind, because whether UPSC asks about nutrition, child labor, education, mental health, child marriage, or adolescent development, the answer ultimately revolves around one central principle, that is, every child deserves the opportunity to develop their full capabilities, and every investment in childhood is an investment in India's future. Now that we understood, now that we have understood child and adolescent development, we move to the next major pillar, that is social justice. Next major pillar of social justice, that is public health and human development. There we will examine why a strong public health care system remains the foundation of an inclusive, productive society. Comes to the main submission part. As far as children is concerned, NFHS 6 and ASER 2024 together mark a structural turn. Chronic deprivation is finally pending while acute deprivation and quality gaps persist, proving that convergence works where it is attempted and fails where departments work alone. This could be deployed in nutrition, ICDS, portion, learning outcomes, and human capital questions. As far as PYQ concern, PYQ corner in 2024, question asked poverty and malnutrition creates a vicious cycle. In 2018, asked hunger goes beyond food availability. In 2016, they asked UPSC Amartya Sen's advocacy of preschool education and primary health care. In 2022, the question asked ECCE and NEP. So you have to observe these kind of questions asked in child development and adolescent malnutrition, hunger, etc. So you have to be very focused as far as this child nutrition is concerned. So far we have understood. So far we have understood the meaning of social justice, the welfare state, women-led development, and the importance of investing in children. Now let us move to another pillar of human development, that is public health. Before discussing hospitals, insurance, primary health care, or disease control, let us begin with one simple question. Why is health considered a social justice issue? At first glance, health appears to be personal matter. People fall sick, they visit doctors, they receive treatment, but a public health is much more than medical treatment. A healthy population is more productive, learns better, earns more, participate more actively in democracy, and contributes more effectively to economic development. Conversely, poor health traps families in poverty, reduces education attainment, weakens productivity, and widens social inequalities. Therefore, health is not merely a medical concern, it is a foundation of human development and inclusive growth. Health is a constitutional responsibility. The, as health as a constitutional responsibility, we are going to examine that. Health is essential. The constitution recognizes that public health is essential for human dignity. Although the right to health is not expressly mentioned as a fundamental right, the Supreme Court has repeatedly interpreted Article 21, the right to life, to include access to health care and medical assistance. Article 21 by Supreme Court. The directive principles of state policy further direct to the state, DPSP direct further state to improve public health, raise the level of nutrition, protect workers, support children, and secure human living conditions. Thus, public health is not simply a welfare program, it is a constitutional obligation flowing from the right to live with dignity. Understanding public health, what we are going to understanding public health, what we are going to examine under the heading of understanding public health. Many people equate healthcare with hospitals. Public health is much broader than hospitals. Healthcare focuses on treating individuals after they becoming ill. Public health seeks to prevent illness before it occurs. For example, let's say safe drinking water, sanitation, vaccination, nutrition, health education, vector control, clean air, maternal care, mental health awareness, and disease surveillance all improve health long before a patient enters a hospital. So, treatment saves lives, prevention protects society. A good health system must therefore combine both. Health outcomes are also shaped by the wider social and commercial environment. Comes to the housing, working conditions, food systems, pollution, urban design, and the marketing of unhealthy products. So, public health policy must therefore act beyond hospitals. Primary health care, the foundation of the health system, that is primary health care. Every modern healthcare system rests upon primary health care. Primary health care is the first important contact between citizens and the health system. It provides preventive, promotive, curative, rehabilitative, and referral services close to the people's home. Its functions include maternal and child health care, immunization, management of common illness, nutrition counseling, screening, mental health support, health education, and referral to higher facilities when necessary. So, primary health care is essentially important because of it reduces avoidable diseases, hospitalization, out of pocket expenditure, and pressure on tertiary hospitals. A strong primary healthcare system also improves equity by reaching rural, tribal, and economically weaker populations. That is why UPSC repeatedly emphasizes on primary healthcare in its questions. As far as data is concerned, India's institutional vehicle for the vision. What is the India's institutional vehicle for this vision? Over 1.85 lakh Ayushman Arogya Mandirs, the upgraded health and wellness centers network, delivering comprehensive primary care including NCD screening and mental health services. As of May 2026, comes to public and private healthcare part. Now let us examine an important contemporary debate, that is, should healthcare be left primarily to the market or should the state play the leading role? The private sector has undoubtedly contributed to advanced medical technology, specialized treatment, innovation, and increased service capacity. However, healthcare differs from ordinary markets. Patients often lack information, medical emergencies reduce consumer choice, treatment costs can be catastrophic, healthcare facilities are unevenly distributed, profit incentives may not always align with public interest. Therefore, markets alone cannot guarantee equitable healthcare. Then comes to the state part. The state must ensure that every citizen, irrespective of income, location, or social background, can access essential health services. Private healthcare can complement public health care, but it cannot replace states' responsibility. A balanced health system requires strong public institutions, effective regulation, transparent pricing, quality standards, and accountable partnerships with private providers. And India's changing disease burden. India's health challenges have also changed significantly. Earlier, communicable diseases, malnutrition, and maternal mortality dominated public health policy. These challenges remain important. However, India now faces an additional burden on non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, obesity, and cancer. Mental health disorders are also increasing. Consequently, India now experiences a triple burden disease. First, unfinished infectious disease. Second, persistent nutritional and maternal health challenges. Third, rapidly increasing lifestyle related illness. This changing epidemiologically profile requires a strong focus on prevention, screening, healthy lifestyle, community awareness, and long term management. Comes to the NFHS 6 reinforce the need to view India's health transition comprehensively. Improvements in coverage coexist with unfinished maternal and nutritional challenges and a growing burden of non-communicable diseases. As far as data is concerned, NFHS 6 documents the entire transition in one data set. That is, institutional deliveries at 90.6%, antenatal coverage at 95.9 percentage, skilled birth attendance at 91.3%. Substantial progress has been achieved in traditional maternal health agenda. Meanwhile, overweight and obesity among women rose to 30.7% and among men 27.3%. Alongside persisting underweight, the textbook double burden of malnutrition and the caesarean section rate jumping from 21.5% to 27.2%, 2%, rising questions of over medicalization and private sector incentives, and only 37.8% compliance with full 180-day course of iron folic acid supplementation. One survey, three burdens, four ready-made answer points. That is maternal and child health. We are going to discuss one of the most one of the most effective ways to improve national health is to invest in mothers and children. Healthy mothers give birth to healthier children. Healthy children perform better in schools, develop strong immunity, and become more productive adults. Maternal nutrition, institutional deliveries, antenatal care, postnatal postnatal care, breastfeeding, immunization, and early childhood nutrition therefore influence the entire life cycle. This explains why public health, nutrition, and child development cannot be viewed separately. They are deeply interconnected. Comes to the mental health part. Public health today extends beyond physical illness. Mental health has become an equally important dimension. That is stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness, substance abuse, academic pressure, and workplace stress increasingly affect all age groups. Unfortunately, mental illness often remains hidden because of stigma, limited awareness, and shortage of trained professionals. Modern public health policy therefore emphasizes early identification, community awareness, school counseling, integration of mental health care into primary health care, and accessible support system, etc. Mental health should be viewed as an integral component of overall health, not as a separate issue. Human resources for health, we are going to discuss, that is human resources for health. What are the human resources for health? No healthcare system can function without trained professionals like doctor, nurses, ashas, ANMs, Anganwadi workers, laboratory technicians, pharmacists, community health officer, and public health specialists from the backbone of healthcare delivery. However, India continues to face shortage, uneven distribution, rural vacancies, training gaps, and excessive workload among frontline workers. Therefore, strengthening human resources, continuous training, career progression, and better working conditions are essential for improving healthcare outcomes. Comes to the most important point, that is health financing. Another important challenge concerns healthcare expenditure. When families pay large amounts from their own pockets, illness can push them into poverty. Therefore, public financing, risk pooling, health insurance, and affordably public health care become critical components of social justice. However, financial protection alone is insufficient. Insurance cannot compensate for the absence of nearby health facilities. Trained personnel or quality primary health care is most important. Hospital treat illness, primary health care prevents illness. Both are necessary, but prevention always produces larger long term social benefits. As far as data is concerned, PMJAY covers hospitalization up to 5 lakh rupees per family per year. As of 28th February 2026, the officially reported figures stood at 43.52 crore Ayushman cards, 36,229 empaneled hospitals, 19,483 public and 16,746 private, and 11.69 crores authorized admissions worth about 1.73 lakh crore rupees, and two milestones to cite. That is, first one, the Ayushman Vayu Vandana extension to all citizens aged 70 plus regardless of income. Second one, 8th June 2026, West Bengal became the 36th. Then NFHS 6 correlated that households cover any health insurance or financing rose from 41 to 60 41 to 60%. Now the balance UPSC expects is public health spending remains about 1.8% of GDP. Now the balance, and against national health policy target 2.5%. And out of pocket expenditure, though declining, still stands near 39% of total expenditure, health expenditure. So technology and public health, Technology and public health we are going to discuss. Technology is transforming healthcare, digital health records, telemedicine, AI assisted diagnostics, electronic disease surveillance, portable health records, and digital monitoring systems improve efficiency and continuity care. However, technology should strengthen human centered healthcare rather than replace it. Digital exclusion, privacy concern, unequal internet access, and limited digital literacy may prevent vulnerable communities from benefiting equally. Therefore, technology must remain an instrumental of inclusion, supported by trained health workers, community participation, and robust data protection. As far as data is concerned, comes to the digital health layer. The Ayushman Bharat digital mission has created over 85 crore ABHA health accounts, and eSanjeevani has crossed roughly 34 crore teleconsultations, genuine access revolutions, provided they remain inclusion first. As far as persistent challenges is concerned, despite significant process, important challenges remain. What is that? Those included like regional disparities, urban level inequalities, shortage of healthcare professionals, poor public health expenditure, out of pocket payments, malnutrition, air and water pollution, mental health stigma, unequal access of vulnerable communities, and growing lifestyle diseases. In addition, that climate change, urbanization, and demographic aging are creating new public health challenges that require long-term planning. These are challenges. What will be the way forward? The way forward should be the future of India's health system lies in strengthening primary health care, preventive care, public health infrastructure, human resources, nutrition, mental health care, community participation, digital innovation, and evidence based policy making. Healthcare should become accessible, affordable, equitable, and people centered. As far as public private sectors should function in partnership with the state, ensuring universal access, quality standards, and accountability. Ultimately, the objective is not merely to treat illness, it is to build a healthier, more productive, and more resilient society. So remember one simple framework, that is, healthy people learn better, educated people work more productively. Productive citizens strengthen the economy. A stronger economy generates greater resources for social development. This creates a virtual cycle of human development. That is why public health is not simply a social sector service. It is an investment in human capital, economic growth, social equity, and constitutional justice. Where the UPSC asks about whether UPSC asks about primary health care, public versus private health care, maternal health, mental health, human resources, or health financing, the answer ultimately rests on one central principle, that is, a strong public health system is the foundation upon which an inclusive, productive, and socially just society is built. Now that we have understood public health, that we move to the next pillar of human development, that is education, skills, and human resources development, where will we examine how education transforms demographic potential into national capabilities. As far as PYQ corner is concerned, in 2024, the question asked market's role in medical education and healthcare alternatives, and 2021 question primary health structure as a precondition for suitable sustainable development. 2020 question COVID and health system preparedness. Then 2018 question community level healthcare intervention. Then 2015 public health versus private curative care. As far as men's ammunition is concerned, NFHS 6 shows that healthcare coverage has expanded substantially, 90.6% institutional deliveries, 60% insurance coverage, but India now confronts a hard challenge of quality NCDs and a financial protection which only primary care led. Prevention first system funded at 2.5% of GDP can meet. This is going to be deployed in every health question. Access versus quality is the 2026 framing. The next chapter we are going to in discuss in next class.